and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, today's topic is the New Deal. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on that video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other, and of course, their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Now, we left off talking about one of the most disastrous times in this nation's history. And remember, it's not just economically speaking. The Great Depression was indeed horrific. And again, just to recap some of the major highlights, we're talking 25% nationwide unemployment. Thousands, millions of people homeless, building these shanty towns that they dubbed very unaffectionately Hoovervilles. And again, 25% unemployment was the average nationwide, but if you just take people of color, African American, Mexicano, you're talking 50% unemployment. This has a not only tremendous economic impact, but also social and cultural, especially when you begin to take in, we start seeing things like the Scottsboro boys I showed you the image of last time, where they're going to be tried for the rape of two white women on a train, just on the accusation. And again, this was done for fear of African American young men taking jobs. Of course, the worst of all, was the repatriation, of Mexican and Mexican Americans. The United States deported some 1 million persons of Mexican descent. About 60%, 600,000 who were U.S. citizens. So it should come as no surprise that the New Deal the Great Depression was bad, horrific, catastrophic. And as a result, due to his association with the Depression, and of course the disastrous fight with the Bonus Army, Herbert Hoover, the President of the United States when the Depression started, is going to get trounced, absolutely positively destroyed in the 1932 election against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so in the election of 32, New York Governor, Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt, promising what he called a new deal for the American public. It seemed at least a radical departure from the failed policies of Herbert Hoover. And this was an electoral blowout. Hoover lost all but 6 states, and I always make the joke in class, what was Pennsylvania thinking? And what this does, though, when Hoover's elected in 1932, this ends the Republican domination of the presidency that had been going on for more than 36 years, which, aside from Woodrow Wilson's presidency, which he largely won due to a split in the GOP back in 1912. And so FDR comes in, and he is facing an unmitigated disaster. And I always love this picture. This is the inauguration parade of FDR in March of 1933. And who's riding alongside him in the car? Of course, Herbert Hoover himself. I mean, can you imagine Donald Trump riding alongside Joe Biden in 2021? Or for that matter, Barack Obama riding next to Donald Trump in 2016. And when he takes over, he's facing an unmitigated disaster. And he later says that the test of our progress is not whether we add to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide for those who have too little. Let me repeat that. He said that the test of our progress as a nation is not whether we add to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. He went on to say 1/3 of the nation is ill-housed, ill-clad, and ill-nourished. This is a radical departure. I mean, it's a complete 180 departure from the traditional view of the US government. This is not the policy of the 1920s with under the ideas of return to normalcy, where the idea is tax breaks for the wealthy. Let's go back to the good old days of the Gilded Age with the huge wealth gap between rich and poor. This is saying, no. We need to help the average American. And again, there's reason to believe this. One is Hoover's policies did not work. And he comes in facing a 25% unemployment rate if you're white. If you're a person of color, 50% unemployment rate. Over 500,000 Americans have lost their homes and farms. Thousands of banks have failed, and millions of people have lost their life savings when banks closed. And remember, this is a worldwide depression. It was facilitating the rise of fascism and communism abroad. And to be clear, there was a lot of that sentiment going on here in the United States. Democratic capitalism was on the defensive. Political analyst Walter Lippmann warned President Roosevelt, saying, "The situation is critical. You may have to assume dictatorial powers." Think about that for a minute. You have a political analyst advising the president that the situation is so bad with the Great Depression of 1933 that maybe we should just forsake democracy, become a dictator. It seemed to be working in places like Nazi Germany. It was working in places like the militarized areas of Japan. It was working in fascist Italy. In these places, a dictatorship was working. Hitler was able to pull Germany out of the Depression within just a few years of taking power. And when I say out of the Depression, I mean by building railroads and by building the Autobahn and by starting car companies and chemical companies, by rearming the nation. Germany is hosting the Berlin Olympics in 1936, just 3 years after he assumes full dictator powers. The militarism that was living in Japan never really experienced the depression the way the rest of the world did, because they had militarized their nation under a dictatorship. And although, in the eyes of some conservatives, FDR may have come close, it is very clear and very evident that FDR did not become a dictator. He did, however, take very decisive action. The weak Republican presidencies of the 1920s were over, and FDR picked up where his cousin Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson had left off when it came to expanding the power of the federal government and that of the presidency itself. In his first inaugural address, he promised bold executive action, sweeping legislation to remedy the Great Depression. And of course, this was called the New Deal. Now, let's be very clear. There was no silver bullet to solving this crisis. This was unprecedented. The New Deal at its heart was a process of trial and error. FDR's brain trust of advisors began to develop conflicting opinions on how to tackle his 3 outlined major challenges. But FDR was a pragmatist. He took a little of column A, he took a little of column B. He was willing to try a variety of approaches as he rolled out his New Deal. Once explaining that, he said, quote, "Take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another," unquote. that pretty much sums up the New Deal in a nutshell. And so, in order to study and kind of break down and understand the New Deal, we kind of break it down into two distinct phases. The first New Deal, which takes place from 1933 through 1935, and then the second New Deal that takes place from 1935 to 1938. Now, during the first phase of the New Deal, the first New Deal, FDR's main concern was responding to the immediate economic crisis and stopping the Depression from getting worse. In other words, we need to plug the holes. We're not going to recover. We're not going to start bailing water per se yet, but we need to plug the holes from sinking further. And then during the second New Deal, when the economy had somewhat staved off and improved, leveled off, the FDR's major goal became constructing and building a social safety net to protect people from a future economic crisis. Okay, so let's start with the first New Deal. Let's end the Depression as best we can. He's faced with three major issues. Number one, reviving the economy. He's got to stimulate the economy to rebound. Number two, relieve the human misery. More than 500,000 people have lost their homes. We're somewhere between 25 and 50% unemployment. You need to relieve the human misery. And then number three, rescue the farmers. The Dust Bowl has been catastrophic. So let's start with the first New Deal. We kind of understand that it breaks down into three distinct phases. You need to financially recover, provide financial recovery. In other words, work on the banking system. You've got to shore up the economic undergirth, the banking system of our nation. Number two, provide industrial recovery. Number three, provide agricultural recovery. And so FDR was at his best during what is called the first 100 days. You see, the first 100 days in office for any president is kind of this measuring stick because you're kind of in that honeymoon phase, usually speaking. Like you were just elected, you're riding a high, people don't really know what to expect, good or bad yet, but they're hoping for something good. And so more things are likely to happen that kind of first 100-day period. And this kind of starts with FDR. And sure enough, during FDR's first 100-day period, it's a period in which Congress passes everything that FDR asked for, even some things he didn't. And so during his first 100 days, he's going to pass massive amounts of legislation. Now, the first order of business was to free up the channels of finance. So on his second day in office, FDR called Congress to enter into a special session and got them to pass the Emergency Banking Act. So what this act did was declare a 4-day banking holiday, during which time all banks in the country would close. So every bank in the nation would close for 4 days, and they would be examined by the federal government. Banks that were determined to be sound, stable, would be permitted to reopen after the 4-day holiday. And then government managers were to provide for those who were in trouble. Again, this is a very dangerous thing. On the one hand, he could have just nationalized the banks. He could have taken them over by the federal government to secure them. And in doing so, he very well might have saved them and convinced the American public that they were safe. But he chose to preserve a separation. He allowed the banks to reopen on their own. Yes, there was oversight. There would be regulations to prevent a future catastrophe. And then he did something masterful. He went on the radio, and he would use these radio talk that he called Fireside Chats to kind of speak into the minds and hearts of every American. Because the radio was the new medium for instant communication. So he would get on the radio and deliver this fireside chat and basically explain what he was doing, why he was doing it, and what the expected outcome was. And he basically convinced the American people that putting their money back into the banks would be a safer bet than hiding your money in a mattress. This is after, we're talking now 4 years, well, 3.5 years of a depression in which millions lost their life savings in the banks. And the thing is, it worked. The following day, deposits began to flow back into the reopened banks. 90% of the banking industry was back in business only days later. Many on the far left had called on FDR to nationalize the banks, to take them over completely by the government. But FDR resisted, and he saved the banking industry. So he does the 4-day banking holiday. And then after that, to prevent a future catastrophe, he instituted new safeguards, including the Glass-Steagall Act, which created the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, the FDIC, to federally insure your bank deposits up to $5,000 in 1933. If you go to any national bank now, you will see that sticker FDIC, each depositor insured up to at least $250,000. Again, it's changed over time, the amount. Again, what the Glass-Steagall Act also did, so number one, it provides insurance. So if the bank were to close, the federal government is guaranteeing your money up to a certain amount. The Glass-Steagall Act also prevented those speculative abuses by separating the investment and commercial banking corporations. In other words, you can't take irresponsible risk with the American savings. So he saves the banking industry. Now, to deal with the industrial sector, he would pass the National Recovery Administration Act, the NRA. And the National Recovery Administration Act, the purpose was to stabilize business and create new labor standards. They drew up codes that would vary from industry to industry in order to provide for fair practices. These included some things like basic labor standards, like a 40-hour work week and a minimum wage, banning child labor under age 16. And finally, by defining these labor practices, the NRA also had the ability to set minimum wages. Now, this initially was somewhat ineffective for people of color because Southern congressmen only voted yes if they, at the state level, could control the program. And again, FDR needs those Southern votes. And so he relents. And the state control ultimately is going to carve out white workers by making them the last hired, the first fired. And in the end, it doesn't really matter anyway, because the Supreme Court is going to rule this is unconstitutional because it's ruled as non-wartime price fixing. Again, that controversial part was not just the minimum wage, but minimum prices. And by doing so, it is going to be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. But again, it wasn't very effective for people of color because, much like we talked about the Reconstruction era, when you turn things back over to the states, racism plays a much larger role, even though it wasn't technically FDR's plan. And so while initially that the NRA is going to work initially, within 2 years it will be gutted and be left ineffective. But for a couple of years, it does help stem the tide of the sinking ship for the industrial sector. The third prong, of course, was the agricultural issue, agricultural recovery. And the first New Deal will see the passage of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA. Essentially, the government would pay farmers to slow down or stop growing crops on part of their land, which drove down supply, it increased prices, thus raising farm income. And it does work in this respect. Farm income across the board will raise from $5.5 billion in 1932 up to $8.7 billion just 3 years later, 1935. So it's effective in the sense it does raise farm wages. Unfortunately, again, even though it was not designed as a racist policy by FDR, as it was implemented on the ground, it became quite racist because the benefits were not distributed equally. Large landowners who control these large areas of land, they would also control which plots of land would be left fallow. In other words, they would decide which plots of land on their farms that they would not grow crops on and still be paid for it. And so what often happened was they ended up cutting the acreage of the tenant farmers and sharecroppers. So think about this for a minute. You're a large landowning farmer. You grow all these crops on your land, plus you rent out your land to sharecroppers and tenant farmers, who are most often people of color or very poor whites. And the government says, hey, we're going to pay you to not farm part of your land. So which land do you think that you're going to choose not to grow on and be paid for it? You figure out very quickly, if you let that be the tenant and sharecropper land, you can still grow all the crops you want on your land, make tons of money from that because the prices are rising, and screw over your tenant farmers and sharecroppers, mostly African American and Mexicano workers, and the government will pay you for it. And so as a result, much like the NRA, those who suffer the most are particularly African American and Mexican Americans. Though again, by 1936, the AAA, much like the NRA, will be struck down by the Supreme Court as being unconstitutional, seen as price fixing. Don't worry, it'll be back later. In fact, we still do this at the present day, where we pay farmers not to farm part of their land. Now, while these programs were designed for immediate relief, again, they were designed to patch the holes. They applied the Band-Aids for immediate relief. And for the most part, even though those two will be declared unconstitutional, they do provide immediate relief. But FDR also wanted to put people back to work. And to do this, he created government jobs. It's not like he's the first one to ever do this, but he creates these these works programs where these are government jobs that the government will pay average Americans to work. And he makes a number of these types of programs. One includes the Civil Works Administration that would rapidly create manual labor jobs for millions of unemployed workers. These are temporary jobs. And you will find that a number of both Mexican and Mexican Americans will take part in these employment opportunities. Now, as this one begins to wind down by 1934, a new program is started, the Public Works Administration. This is now a longer-term employment, large-scale public works, like dams, bridges, hospitals, schools. The goal is to provide employment, which in turn will stabilize the purchasing power, because if you have money, you can spend it, which will eventually help revive the economy. And once again, this is not a racist endeavor. This is not racially exclusionary. And therefore, a number of Mexican Americans will take part in this program. However, the longest enduring of these public works groups was the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. This will last, if you see the dates, from 33 to 42. And this provided unskilled manual labor jobs related to conservation and the development of natural resources on rural lands. It was designed to provide jobs for young men, while at the same time implementing a general natural resource conservation program in every state and territory. They built roads, bridges, campgrounds, fish hatcheries. They planted trees. They taught farmers how to control soil erosion to prevent the Dust Bowl. They fought fires. And for their efforts, they were paid $30 a month. $25 of which went home to their families. And it also would provide educational opportunities for these young men, many of whom would earn their high school diplomas. And once again, many Mexican Americans would take part in these employment opportunities. And what this CCC especially did was help to spread Mexicanos to new areas of the country, to such places as the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where the CCC was tasked with planting trees or replanting trees that were deforested from the logging industry. In fact, if you go to the Upper Peninsula, even today, you can see nice straight rows of trees as planted by the CCC. But let's be very clear. These programs are meant to apply to everyone. These were not passed by FDR in a racist manner. But because the implementation was done on a local or state level, it was often at times applied in a very racist manner. For example, the CCC camps were racially segregated. And in places like Texas, many African Americans were told falsely that the camps were only for whites. And in Texas, only 400 African Americans, less than 5% of the total enrolled in the state, actually participated. And again, if you were a Mexicano, it really depended on your ability to speak English clearly and the skin tone of your complexion of your skin, how light or dark you were. Could you pass for being whiter? And as a result of this, these programs, they do their job as what they're intended, but they were very uneven in helping people of color. But nonetheless, it does help stem the tide of the Depression. And from there, we will move into phase 2, the second New Deal. But that's a topic for next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.